So I'm one of Dr. Kopp's graduate students, and I was on the ground in Goderich for the survey. So I'm going to talk about my observations there, but I'm also going to take a little bit of a step back. I need to figure out how to do it. Perfect. So before I talk about the actual damage survey that I did in Goderich, I'm going to take a step back and talk about how tornadoes develop. So what conditions are required for them to form. Environment Canada issues watches and warnings. What's the difference and how can we learn from them? The Fujita scale, which is the damage scale that we use to rate tornadoes, it's actually not directly wind speeds that are measured, but actually the damage that we observe. I'm going to talk about the case study, which is Goderich. And then I'm actually going to talk about how we're using findings from the damage surveys in the lab to learn more. So this is a map that indicates areas across the world that are at risk for tornadoes. As you can see from the map, a large area of Canada is covered, and it's a very large number of people in both Canada and the United States, as well as other areas of the world, that could potentially be impacted. It doesn't mean you're going to be impacted in your life, but there is a risk. So for tornadoes to develop, you need a number of conditions in the atmosphere, namely moisture, instability, an inversion, shear, and a trigger. Now, just because all of these exist doesn't mean that a tornado is going to develop. So for moisture, you need about a dew point of 15 degrees Celsius or higher. So you need to have a lot of moisture and a lot of heat. For instability, if you imagine a parcel of air, it needs to be warmer than the air around it in order for it to rise. So you need that convection, the air moving upwards. It's going to continue rising upwards and cause some instability until it hits a layer of air that is as warm as it, or warmer. It's going to get trapped, and that's what we call the inversion. So normally air decreases about 2 degrees for every 1,000 feet. So it's going to raise for a while, but eventually there's going to be an area in the atmosphere where the temperature goes up. And the air is going to stop there. It's going to trap all of the energy below that and allow the storm to grow. So we need that inversion in order to keep all the energy there and allow the storm to grow. Shear, it can be wind shear in either direction or speed. So we want changing speeds with altitude or changing directions with altitude. And that gets the storm to start rotating, which eventually can develop into a tornado. And the last is the trigger. You need something to make this storm pop. So you need the cap in order to have the storm develop. But then you need something to trigger the storm to blow up, to cause this. This is typically a front, so a cold front coming through. It can also be remnants of previous storms that happened throughout the day. Sorry, really dry. Or it actually could be some changes in elevation at different things. Each storm is different. We can't ever guarantee that we're going to have something, but if we're going to have something, these conditions, all of them, have to be present. So this is a schematic of a supercell. Most tornadoes that we talk about are developed through supercells, but not all of them. So here the storm is moving from left to right, and if you were standing here and getting the storm moving towards you, you'd actually get a drop in temperature as the gust front passes. You'd get light rain, and then heavy rain, potentially hail, and then the tornado would occur. There's a couple things I want to show here. The height of this storm, if it's going to produce a really big tornado, could be upwards of 70,000 feet. This anvil portion here means that it's actually hit the jet stream, and the jet stream is stretching that cloud out. Above a tornado is going to be a spot, if you can see it, if it's not trapped by other clouds, is an overshooting top. It's going to be visible bump on top of the anvil, and that indicates that there's really strong updraft currents. So if a storm is oriented like this, you do typically have a warning with increasing rain, potentially hail, and then the tornado. So alternatively, if we look at it from above, this is what it would look like on radar or satellite or anything like that. Again, the storm is moving from left to right. You're going to have the light rain, some darker rain, potentially hail, and where this hook is likely where the tornado is going to develop. When this hook is visible on satellite or radar, that's when the weather stations are starting to think about issuing those warnings. It's starting to show rotation, and it could develop into a tornado. There's no guarantees, though. You also often have storms that are flanking off, and they can actually be the trigger for potential future storms. So it's really a cyclical effect. Last summer, I had the opportunity to go storm chasing with the University of Manitoba. First, we had to do a course on how tornadoes develop, or how superstorms develop, but then we actually got on the road. We took 4 vans full of students and a camera crew. I'm standing right here. I was still on crutches, which meant for an interesting experience. So as I said, we took 4 vans full of camera crews and students. There were students from the University of Manitoba, University of Quebec and McGill, as well as myself, and professors from the University of Manitoba, and also some Environment Canada meteorologists. There was a documentary filmed on the class. This is the only class of its kind in Canada. We traveled approximately 6,500 kilometers in 8 days, which meant we spent a lot of time in the car, and we hit 6 different states. So the vehicles used different equipment to track storms, because when you're chasing them, you want to find them, but you also want to make sure they don't find you. So we had satellite weather coming into the vehicles. We also had wireless weather coming into the vehicles. We lost it for a little while because the professor forgot to pay his bill, but we figured that out. And one really neat thing for me, because I'm a big geek, was we knew we were in the right spot when we woke up and found the TIV parked in the parking lot. So this is a tornado intercept vehicle from Sean Casey when he was filming his IMAX. And it's also on the Discovery Channel, Storm Chasers. So when we woke up in Nebraska one day, it was parked there, so we were in the right area. Unfortunately, we did not see any tornadoes. In the history of this course, no class has ever seen tornadoes, but we saw some really cool storms. Often in southwestern Ontario, the storms are rain-wrapped, so you can't see the classic formations that you see in the textbook. But when you're out in the plains in the southern states, you really can. So this is the rain wall here, and then you can see the cold pool that's moving out. So we stopped to take a lot of really cool pictures. It's an amazing experience, and now I understand more about how they develop, which helps me be prepared for when I'm heading out for a damage survey. I've headed to a couple damage surveys, but this is the first time I looked for the storms before they happened. So again, the watches versus warning. Watches means that there is the potential for severe activity, so you should be aware of it and have a plan. A warning means that it's happening or imminent, it's going to happen very shortly. You need to take immediate precautions right away. So watches can be issued many hours in advance. Warnings, if we have enough warning, but often they're just minutes. And we're going to talk a little bit about the timeline in Goderich. So damage surveys, obviously they happen after the event, and they're used to assess the damage. We assist Environment Canada. They've been doing damage surveys for a number of years, but it's a nice team. We bring the structural side of things, and they bring the meteorology side of things. So at the end of the survey, we want to learn, but we also want to rate the Fujita scale. To do that, we use damage indicators. They can be a house, a building, a commercial building, but we're also looking into using trees, cars, street signs, different things that exist in our environment that we can use to try and figure out what the wind speeds were, what the damage was, how we can do this. For each damage indicator, there are a number of degrees of damage, and they escalate, starting with a little bit of damage to catastrophic loss. So the Fujita scale is based on damage, as I said. So if you have moderate damage, it's going to be towards the mid-range. If you have severe damage, it's going to be towards the higher range. A challenge when working with the media for these damage surveys is they want an answer immediately. We don't have an answer immediately because we need to do this survey. It could be just 1 or 2 structures that cause it to be higher. Or if we're going to say that it's a very serious event because this structure failed, well, did that structure fail from the storm, or was it not built properly? We really need time to do these surveys before we attach a number to it. So I'm just going to go into 1 degree of damage. There are a number of them that we use. So this is for a house, 1 or 2 stories, typical house in almost anywhere in North America. So for the 1st degree of damage, it's just the threshold of damage. There might be some trees down around that have impacted the house. But when you get into 2, you're losing some of your shingles, possibly your gutters or awnings, maybe some vinyl siding. When you get to 3, you're probably going to break some windows. Again, it's from that debris, from degree of damage 2, that's causing you to break your windows, because as something breaks, those elements are now in the wind field and can impact other structures. When we get to 4, you're losing your roof decking. So here that's typically sheathing, and you are going to lose a number of your shingles or whatever you use to cover your roof. If you have a chimney, it could also collapse. For degree of damage 5, your house can shift off its foundation. Degree of damage 6 is the one that I'm really looking into, and that's your roof structure removed. So that's more than just shingles and sheathing, but actually your trusses and some structural elements. You could then get in 7 through 10 are walls collapsing and eventual destruction. So these are just some images of different typical degrees of damage. So here you can see on this structure there's some shingles missing in a couple different areas, whereas this is missing some sheathing plates. It's not missing the structure of the roof, but it is missing some of the coverings. Whereas degree of damage 6 is a portion of the roof is missing in this image. So we do these degree of damage assessments for almost every structure that we find on a damage survey. Degree of damage 7, there's some loss of walls. And 10, finally, is destruction of a house. So going into Goderich a little bit more, it happened on the 21st of August at approximately 4 p.m. local time. It was rated an F3 by Environment Canada, and there was 1 fatality. So I'm going to talk about the timeline just a little bit. At 3:30, the radar image started to show a developing storm over the lake. It takes about 5 minutes for the computer to crunch the data after you do a radar sweep, so they started looking at it at about 3:35. A marine tornado warning was issued at 3:38 local PM. We do a sweep between every 5 and 10 minutes of the radar, so the 3:40 radar showed that the storm was still strengthening. At 3:48, a tornado warning was issued on land for the town of Goderich, and working backwards from the data, OPP thinks it hit at about 3:55. So there was only a couple minutes that the warning was out, and a number of people didn't get that warning. So that's an issue that they're looking at. We need to get to the bottom of this. What's the best way of getting that information out? Environment Canada did see it. They did issue the warnings, but it didn't get out to the people. This is actually an image from someone who was sitting near the lighthouse, if you know Goderich, in the area, and saw the storm approaching. The storm is actually visible here, but it's wrapped in rain, so you can't see that there's a tornado in it. The next image that he took, actually you can see the line of rain that's coming in. It's distinct. It's not raining somewhere, and it's raining really hard at the next place.
But was the tornado actually touching the water as it came to the city, or did it come down into the city?
We don't actually have that information because there was no pictures or anything like that. Radar doesn't typically go all the way to the ground, so we're not entirely certain. But we know that it hit landfall at the Stenabaugh mines, which is just inland of there, and it caused damage there. So whether it was in contact with the water or just afterwards, not entirely certain, but as soon as it hit land, it started to cause damage.
And in this case, I don't know whether I'm getting ahead, but did it hit land and then just stay, or did it touch and then touch again? Or
it's a fairly consistent damage path for 20 kilometers.
I think on Chris Wilson's video you can actually see the water spout on YouTube. So Google Chris Wilson on YouTube, Goderich, and you can see he has a wonderful video of it.
He shared these images with us, I think on this Monday morning when we were in the Emergency Operations Center. He shared some of his images with us. He's from Ohio and was just visiting. So I was on the ground at approximately 7 p.m. It's about an hour-and-a-half drive, so we got on the road as soon as we knew what was going on. I traveled with Randy Mawson from Environment Canada up there, and we started the survey at about 7:15 after talking to the Emergency Operations Center. At this point in time, the city was entirely shut down, and no one was allowed in or out. But being with Environment Canada and being on the official survey team, we got police or fire escorts the entire way. So this is roughly 7 p.m. looking at the damage. There was a couple camera crews that were starting to arrive, but really we were one of the first ones on the scene, except for the ones that actually experienced the storm. So none of this has been cleaned up. It's just the way it was. There were some emergency vehicles that needed to come in, but other than that, this is immediately afterwards. And the devastation was just incredible. We really didn't get to do too much of a survey on the Sunday night just because the sun was setting and there was so much going on with trying to find out if anyone was trapped, what was going on. The police and the firefighters had their hands full. We tried to help as much as we could. Environment Canada was involved in all of the press conferences that evening. I tried to stay to the side, but if you look carefully, I am there. What's interesting is that we didn't see too much of the other than the downtown, but it was devastating enough that we called in for 3 other teams to help us. So another 2 professors came from the Western University, and a number of Environment Canada people came as well the next day. So on this survey, each one's a little bit different, but we concentrated on determining the damage path. So where did it make land, where did it do its destruction, and where did it end? In this situation, it's about 400 to 500 meters wide in the downtown core, and it lasted more than 20 kilometers, ending up in Ben Miller. Incidentally, that was one of the hotels that they suggested we stay at. Wasn't open. So at the downtown core, we looked at the masonry structures that were there. We also looked at trees. Because there are so many trees in the Goderich area, there was a lot of different failure mechanisms that we could observe, and different species that we could observe as well. And then because it hit an urban area, there was a lot of debris that was trapped in the field.
And before you get into some of this, the downtown core of Goderich and the masonry structures, is that typical of southwestern Ontario, or is Goderich seen as...
Goderich is...
Similar to the tree cover, is that typical of...
The tree coverage is probably pretty typical. What's interesting is that Goderich is one of 2 cities in Ontario that was designed from the beginning. So it's a very unique downtown core, and they're very old, very beautiful buildings. I went there a lot as a kid growing up, so it was really interesting to see the devastation in the places that I used to hang out in the summer. It's probably a little bit different than a lot of other southwestern Ontario towns just because of the age of the structures, and it was around the courthouse. There's some unique road structures, and it's probably not exactly typical. When you get out into the suburbs that were impacted, that would be more like southwestern Ontario. But we didn't concentrate on that so much for this survey. We concentrated on just getting a general idea and helping with the Fujita rating.
One interesting angle or aspect to the age of the structures was the existence of asbestos. And we've never really had to deal with that in the past with a catastrophe of this nature. And it's one of the reasons why the downtown core was shut off for so long, and one of the reasons why insurance adjusters and others weren't allowed into that core for quite some time.
A lot of the structures were double bricked, and when different walls collapsed, those bricks came tumbling down. So you really had to be careful to walk around them because you didn't know what was around. I'll show some of the impact that the bricks did, but the amount of debris in the field was substantial. It was more than I've ever seen. I've only done a couple surveys, but even just looking at past pictures, there was a lot of debris with this. And it's mostly the debris that caused the damage in the buildings that we examined. So this is just a schematic of likely where we think the tornado path happened. There's a little bit of give and take because it is 400 to 500 meters wide, the damage path. So it did cross over on the Sifto plant, and that was where the 1 fatality was. And it pretty much took a beeline for the downtown. So it went right down West Street, through the courthouse, and then it continued all the way through to Ben Miller. So just looking at the Sifto plant a little bit, this is a double brick structure, masonry structure. The portion of the second wall collapsed, and the roof actually collapsed as well. The gentleman that passed away was actually on one of the cranes, loading a boat. So we looked at the downtown core a lot. That's obviously what Goderich is known for, and that's where we concentrated a lot of our efforts. Some of the cameras that we use for these surveys are GPS enabled, so whenever possible there's a little schematic that shows where I took this picture and what direction I was facing. The little schematic, north is up, and the path went from the left to the right down West Street. So this is a 3-story structure, and the entire 3rd story was destroyed, and a good portion of the 2nd story. And as you can see, the debris field is huge. Yes?
How old is that building? When was it made? Built?
I'm not entirely certain on that. They varied, but most of them were built in the early 1900s, from what I was told. We didn't have a chance to talk to the locals very much because they weren't allowed. I know that that information is available to some of the insurance adjusters, but we don't have access to that.
The 1890 to 1920, somewhere.
So if we look at this building a little bit closer, you can see that actually the two bricks, in some situations, detached from each other, and the outer brick has fallen. Some of the inner brick is still left standing, but just the amount of debris, the damage is incredible. This is what Goderich was known for. There's also a lot of damage to vehicles. It was around 4 p.m., so the market had just closed on the courthouse square. So this vehicle was actually pushed up and over the curb and likely only stopped there because it hit a utility pole. We just heard earlier this week that there's been a book released that chronicles a lot of the stories that were told, the people that were experiencing this, and some of the vehicles that I'll show later were actually occupied at the time. We've ordered a couple of the books. They should be in soon. So again, this is another picture of the square. The orange, yellowish building next to J. Carmen's was a 3-story that had a lovely roof. The roof is no longer there, and a significant portion of the 3rd story is gone. So the Weather Network joined us on Monday morning to do some information as well. They're really trying to work on getting some advice out to people on how to respond to these situations. These videos are available online. They do have meteorologists on staff that often try and come and help. This is actually a chip truck that was part of the market. Very heavy truck, and it was completely knocked over on its side, right on the square. And if you look at this bench, it's actually embedded more than an inch into the roof of the van truck.
Let me go back just to the window damage. Why do you think those windows are broken?
Debris impacts. So there was just a number of bricks and other pieces of wood, structural elements that had failed that were in the windshield, and they've all been impacted. We've done some research on glass. I'll touch on it a little bit later, but these are debris impacts.
Like, if that kind of damage is happening to every window for that building, I just hope nobody was outside. Scary.
Well, they said that if the tornado had happened even just a half an hour earlier, there would have been a lot more fatalities because it was a Sunday towards the end of the summer. Goderich has wonderful markets on the weekends, and just everything had been packed up and heading home. Air ambulance, 3 orange air ambulances were dispatched on the Sunday, but there was only the 1 fatality. So again, the chip truck, that concrete bench was embedded more than an inch into the roof of the van. This is a church that is just southwest of the town square, I guess you would call it, and it suffered some damages to its chimney and its steeple. So here you can see that the steeple is missing above the windows. And if you go to a side view, all of the bricks that used to be behind those windows have actually fallen back and are found on the ground behind. So this is West Street. This is upwind of the Goderich Town Square, so it would have come right down this street and then impacted the courthouse. This is a roof truss that was taken off this building. Another of the buildings along here were destroyed. There was one newer building on the south side of the street that sustained almost no impact. It was inset a little bit from the street. I believe it was a municipal type building.
Were those the same vintage that on the roof that ripped off?
Pardon?
Is that an early?
It was an earlier structure.
Do you know if these buildings suffered such damage that they had to be completely removed?
A number of them have been destroyed already.
But one of the buildings on this street had essentially no damage at all?
Very little. It was set back from the street, but it was newer construction and there was not a failure of the roof. This roof structure, it was a flat roof. There's differences with the buildings, but with the changes of construction and technology, you can't say definitively, but that building did quite well.
So, can I ask, so do you know the building techniques used then? Did they attach the roof to the walls, or did they just sit it on there?
That's a challenging statement to make. Each building is different. even newer construction, Dr. Kopp often talks about a survey in Vaughan where a residential house is supposed to have the roof attached, and it wasn't.
Well, that's what made me ask the question, because I remember the Vaughan stuff. One neighborhood was built in the 70s and the roof was just sitting there, and another one was built in the 90s and it had toenails. But in the turn of the century, or whenever these were built, did they do better than that? That's part of my question. Is they overbuilt or did it right back in the day?
Some of the older buildings are still standing, which would lead me to believe that, yes, they were built to a higher quality. Some of the buildings that failed may have been built to a lesser quality. There wasn't the building codes then that we do have now. I'm not sure that we could really assess how it was built, just because the devastation was so advanced. But also, the research that we're concentrating on is more houses. I'm not a structural engineer. I'm not as familiar with these structures, which is why when we did this survey, we tried to get a general feel, but we didn't do a full in-depth that we would normally do for a residential area.
You can't get into these buildings either and take a look after. So you can't get up and see the roof. It's a different form of construction than we're normally used to, but we can't actually go and see because they won't let us in the building. So there's challenges getting data.
We had to be escorted in and out of the area. It was entirely closed down. We still had police escorts with us at all times to make sure we didn't get too close to things. So one thing that was especially devastating to the community was the loss of all the trees around the courthouse square. I don't think there was a single one standing. If there was, they were missing all of their leaves, most of their branches. And you can just really get a picture of how much debris was caught by these trees before they fell. This was a truck, again on West Street, which is directly along the path, and it has actually, the wheels have come off the rims. It's very typical. We see a lot of mud damage when we see tornadoes. That's one of the indicators that we look for. If there's mud splatter on multiple sides of the building, that indicates that it's possible rotation. One of the other things that we do when we do damage surveys are, is it a tornadic event or is it a downburst? We have to look to see what the damage tells us.
So how do wheels come off the rims?
Not entirely certain.
Is it to do with atmospheric pressure changing or something?
Is what to do
with the wheels, that rubber coming off the rim, is that because of maybe that change in temperature or pressure?
I think it's the way the truck comes to a stop.
Oh.
But how does that happen?
Well, I think
so fast?
I think the truck was thrown and landed sideways and skidded and ripped the tires off.
Looks like the airbags went off too.
Yeah. The wheels didn't break.
Not in this vehicle.
Okay.
But there was a number. This vehicle, we weren't able to find out if it was moving or not, if they were driving. It did appear to be parked, but there are a couple vehicles that I'm going to show in subsequent slides that we know were moving, because we have eyewitness accounts. Yep.
With a hurricane, there's one side that's stronger than the other side. Is that true in tornadoes?
There is variability. Not as much, because when you look at the hurricanes, it's the quadrants that are moving. Tornadic activity is more almost in bands. The highest wind speeds are at the core, so that's where the damage is the strongest, and then it actually peters out to the edge. So it's more like there is a strong band of really severe damage, and then as you go out wider. So the strongest is in the center of the path, and then as the damage goes out. These storms can be pretty large. The damage path was 40 to 50 meters, but we did see that beyond there was damage, but it was tended to be debris that was trapped in the field, not the actual physical tornado that was passing through. So just talking a little bit more about tree failures, just because there was so much evidence, and one of the professors at Western University that's concentrating on trees was up there with us. So this is a mature tree in a forest that failed near Ben Miller. It's what we call a stem failure. So the tree trunk breaks about 2 to 3 meters above the ground surface. So to give you an indication, that little black dot that you can see is actually there, and this is Dr. Miller. So it's quite tall, and it broke about 3 meters above the ground or so. And there was a number of trees that were like this in a well-done forest. They were all well-rooted, healthy forest out near Ben Miller. The fire crews and power crews had a lot of work to do with the trees down. A number of roads were blocked, which hampered emergency vehicles getting onto the scene. The other one that's very typical is called a wind throw. And so the wind actually pushes against a large part of the leafed section of the tree, the top of the tree, and just pushes it straight over, and it fails by the root ball swinging up. So you can see the root ball here. All the soil that's entrained in the roots comes with it, and it creates a massive crater in the ground. So here you can see the crater with Drs. Miller and Dr. Newson from Western University. This is a wind throw or root ball failure here at the courthouse, and you can see that there's actually debris in the hole and entrained in the tree. There's garbage cans that are up there as well.
Yeah, I understand that there was a tornado back in 1996, and all these trees were replanted after that.
I'm not familiar with that. I know there's a lot of fundraising efforts to replace them right now.
They had lost them back in the 90s, and so they did again fundraise, and they planted all these beautiful trees. They matured, and they're gone again.
Yeah, they were gorgeous. They were healthy. They were well maintained. That's one challenging aspect with using trees as damage indicators is it a healthy tree? Is it getting enough nutrients? How big is it? If it's even been trimmed, that's the top of the tree relative to the roof system. You need to know how large they are in comparison. So there's a lot of factors within trees. So it's interesting to see a healthy urban environment with lots of trees and get these images. The final kind is a root failure. And it actually breaks off almost at the surface, maybe a couple inches below, and it's typically that the tree has been rotted. So there was, I think, 2 sites that we saw this. So you can see that it's not as dense, it's not as healthy, it just snapped off at the bottom. So again, I'm going to touch on the debris field. There was just so much debris in the field, and a couple sources. So this, you can see, it's metal sheathing from some of the roofs that were upstream. It got deposited in the courthouse square. These are some of the bricks that fell off one of the double-bricked buildings. This is on West Street. This has almost no engineering value, but it was a cool picture. Venetian blinds in a window. I just thought it was cool. So this is the vehicle that I alluded to earlier. It was occupied, this blue van, by a family and 2 children. They said that they got pushed around, but that they walked out with almost not a scratch. If you're interested in their story, it is in that book about Goderich. One thing I would like to point out is there is a chair in this tree. It's from a block up the street from a children's daycare. 3rd story failed, and the classroom was obliterated, and the trees got caught. The chairs got caught in the trees farther down.
Just one?
Oh no, there was lots of chairs. That was the only one that got caught in a tree. There's actually lots in the trees that were on the ground. So this was a vehicle that got impaled by a number of structural elements from buildings that had failed. Incidentally, the Goderich courthouse had very little damage structurally. Most of the damage was from water infiltration and broken windows. This is a book talking about who was in the court system next week that actually got sucked out of the building and was on the grass. This is a vehicle that was turned onto its side and stopped by a utility pole. That's a one-way sign post around the Goderich Square. This vehicle was really interesting to us. There's actually a brick in the windshield. We thought that it was rather odd that it stopped that way in the windshield. When we looked at it a little more closely, it actually went through the driver's side window and went through the windshield and stopped. So it went through the vehicle. It's actually exiting the windshield, not entering it at this point in time. There's a number of bricks actually in the vehicles as well. So when we go to a damage survey, we try and learn as much about the failures that we can observe in the field, but we don't know how they happened. We want to work backwards and figure out what exactly is happening, what is causing these, and how can we make the structures more resilient. So we take what we learn in the damage surveys, and then we try and replicate, reproduce, study it in a lab setting, which is controlled, and we can do a number of iterations. So one of our best tools for this is our full-scale testing facility, the Insurance Research Lab for Better Homes. At this facility, we have tested roof-to-wall connections, pressure equalization and wall systems, sheathing, cladding, and windows. A number of this work is ongoing. A number of this work has been done, but we also collaborate with other universities across North America and around the world to do some of this research together. Marie Morrison did a doctoral thesis here and studied the roof-to-wall connections on a gable roof, which has a long ridge and just two surfaces on the roof system. And he found that the roof as a whole is stronger than any one individual connection. So we've done single roof-to-wall connections and studied and failed them in the lab, and the roof has an overall capacity greater than that. So there's load sharing going on. We really want to understand that more. So we take it back to the boundary layer wind tunnel laboratory, which is a scale testing facility. And here we can work on pressure and uplift on residential roofs. We can also look at vehicles, street signs, and trees to assess their use as future damage indicators. And we can also look at different things that are of interest in currently, wind loads on solar panels around residential roofs and different things like that. I'm going to talk more in detail about the pressure and uplift on residential roofs because we're learning from the Three Little Pigs full-scale facility, and this is what my thesis is on. So here we have a house from Vaughan. You may have seen it before. It's been used in a number of different presentations and reports. Fairly new construction, but the roof failed. And it's theorized, it was found that a lot of it was caused by internal pressurization. The garage door got blown in, and there was a large uplift on the roof, and the roof failed, and it hit its neighbor. So this is not typical of what we see, but this is something that we see in damage surveys, that the roof has failed and it's flown. It's no longer on the original structure, and it is part of the debris field now and can impact other structures. For instance, this neighbor's house, most of the damage was caused by the flying roof. So we have to differentiate between failure and flight. So a roof can fail before it actually flies. So we're trying to figure out what are the different wind speeds that cause that, how are the mechanisms different, because right now when we see a failure, we typically see a flight. The roof is no longer there, it's missing parts, they're on another structure. But we can also see from Cyclone Yasmin damage surveys down in Australia that this connection has failed. This is a roof-to-wall connection for typical construction for their houses down there, and the nails have pulled out. So this roof has failed, but it's still physically in place. But should it be impacted by another storm, it's going to be greatly weakened. How do we account for that in damage surveys? How do we account for that in the designs? How do we understand this more? So when a roof fails, it doesn't necessarily fly. What's the difference to make it fly after it fails? Which is part of my research. So those are the nails that have been pulled out. So this is a particle image velocimetry flow field image. So we can do this in our scale wind tunnel. We actually put very tiny particles of olive oil in the wind tunnel, and we use lasers to illuminate them like a flash, and we take high-speed images. And when we look at two images that are taken sequentially, we can actually track individual particles and figure out what the flow field is happening. And this gives us a lot of information. What's happening when the wind hits the wall? What happens when it hits the roof? Is it separating? And different things like that. As you can see, it's very complicated. There's winds that are separating off the roof, there's some vortices, it's going in every different direction. So if we're trying to find a single wind speed to categorize a roof failure or a roof flight, which wind speed do we use? What kind of a speed are we using? Because wind varies in space and in time. So how do you choose one single representative wind speed for damage surveys? So this is the first round of my testing that just completed last week, so I don't have any results to show. Although this is a house, typical two-story house in southwestern Ontario or across Canada, and we're actually tracking in 4 different locations what the velocity is doing in the tunnel, and we have everything scaled. So this is a 1 to 20 scale house, so it's 20 times smaller than a standard house. And in order to scale it properly that the roof would fly off as it would fly off in a full-size house, it has to be 8,000 times lighter. So this roof weighs about 500 grams. So for the setup, we're using 4 velocity probes to measure the velocity approaching the house at these 4 locations. These velocity probes take measurements 100 times a second and record all 3 velocity components, so all directions, and also the pressure that's locally acting on it. We also have electromagnets and contacts. We use these to simulate the roof-to-wall connections, which Dr. Morrison studied in detail in his thesis, and they're scaled to simulate the holding force that a house would normally have. So a typical holding force for a house is about 2.2 kilonewtons, which doesn't mean too much, but each one of these electromagnets holds exactly 126 grams. Now, the electromagnets that we can buy are stronger than what we need, so we actually use masking tape to create a bit of an air gap, and each one of these has been calibrated. So the holding force generated by these magnets is comparable to what would exist in a standard built-to-code house here in Ontario or Canada. We're also using a laser, which tracks if the roof is popping up a little before it fails, or whether it's flying off. And it also runs at 100 times per second, so we have data from the wind speed and actually what the laser is saying the roof is doing. So we're going to take this and figure out what's happening in the wind field, what's causing these to fail. Is it a spatial average? Is it a time average? What kind of a descriptive wind speed can we use to describe both failure and flight, which currently in the Fujita scale are treated as the same? We're also working on some other damage indicators. This was a picture from Goderich that a stop sign had been pushed over, and we actually have replicated sign in the wind tunnel. This is just a simple square sign, but we're going to be changing out the shape of the plate and the height and different things like that. We're doing a very similar setup with the velocity probes and the laser to track when it's moving and different things like that. And we're also looking at vehicles. These vehicles are also being done in a vortex generator down in the States to try and relate how does straight line winds versus rotating winds affect things. So just in summary, the updated damage scale that we're working on, so improved damage indicators and degrees of damage based on what we see out in the field, will help us to predict what wind speeds actually cause that and what's responsible for the damage. But these damage surveys and also the work that we're doing at Western University will work to ultimately build more resilient structures. When we understand how they fail, we can try to prevent that failure and make our structures safer. So I'd like to acknowledge some people that have made this all possible and open the floor up for any questions. We look really cool when we're doing damage surveys.
That's what the bricks.
Sure.
When a tornado goes through, I can see branches flying through the air and breaking windows and things. So I think of bricks just falling off and coming down to the ground. But those bricks were actually
impaled into vehicles.
Flying through the air?
Yeah, we found some on the Goderich, the square that's with the courthouse, and that's a significant distance downwind.
So would the brick have fallen off the building and then the wind picks up and hurls it?
Most of the brick does fall down. It's probably a couple bricks that get pulled into the field and travel, but as you saw from the one image with all the bricks on the ground, most do just fall to the ground. It's a couple that travel some distance.
Imagine you driving to these sites, bricks flying. Scary.
No, that's only when I was doing the storm chasing. After, we get a phone call, usually between 10 and 20, 30 minutes afterwards, and we get on the road as quickly as we can. I have a bag packed at my desk at all times with everything that we need.
So the downtown Goderich area, there's a lot of brick buildings. There's a lot of bricks flying around. You sit on that one building, where all the windows are broken by flying debris. Was there more damage there because of the brick buildings, say compared to a neighborhood with, vinyl siding and so on?
I think it was partially the bricks, but it was also, there was just so much in the debris field. It wasn't just bricks, it was 2x4s and wood and different things like that. Because the buildings are all very close together, there was a lot of debris in the field. You do see that evidence in residential areas as well. One image that always stuck out is an image I took in Leamington from a couple years back. There's a piece of roof decking that's embedded 3.5 inches into the stucco concrete that someone has in their backyard for their house instead of vinyl siding. It's a piece of just regular particle board that's embedded in, and significantly embedded in. So you have debris challenges in every situation, although because these buildings had so much debris because of the brick and everything like that, I think that's what caused most of the damage downtown. We did look at a couple of the houses, although it was challenging because they were all closed and we had to prioritize where we could do, and there was debris damage in the houses as well, but it wasn't as significant as the downtown core.
So it doesn't matter if it's a brick or a chunk of particle board.
It's going to fly.
This being work done, like, if there's enough wind for a shingle to fly, it will break a window. So basically, if they're coming off. I don't have data on bricks, but roof tiles, so clay tiles, we've measured in the wind tunnel can travel about 50% of the wind speed. So, you know, with that kind of weight, you can see the kind of damage it's going to do. That's a lot of momentum.
And the wind speeds.
And the wind speeds are very high here. Right, yeah, they're very high.
Do you know what the building code says about debris?
I'm not aware of that.
Does it? It doesn't say. It says build a house that can withstand a 15-second gust of X. Down
in Florida, there are certain counties that the windows have to withstand a missile, but they're not residential houses. They're when I was in the consulting world, I worked on a hospital down in Florida, and the missiles, the windows and cladding and everything had to be designed to withstand a missile, which is basically a golf ball launched. And there are certain counties in Florida that have those requirements, but from what I understand, it's not for houses, it's for structures that need to last in the event of an emergency. You need your hospital still operational.
In this case, it was an F3, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we talked like one tornado, damaged swath, half a kilometer wide for 20 kilometers. Like in the States, what we see like hundreds of tornadoes that hit like 6 states all at the same time. Is there a reason why we don't see that in Canada, or could we see that here? Or was there more than one tornado in this instance?
There wasn't more than one tornado in this instance, but in Ontario we have had days where there's been 2 different tornadoes. Vaughan, there was 2 different tornado tracks. The challenge is that if the conditions exist, there can be as many tornadoes as the conditions exist. Down in the States, you've got a lot warmer temperatures, a lot more of moisture. In the southern states, in the plains where the tornadoes typically happen in the States, all the moisture is from the Gulf of Mexico, and it gets pulled up in the summer. Interestingly enough, in Canada, often the moisture is from crops. So there's different times that tornadoes are more likely in the States versus Canada, because the moisture that fuels our storms is actually coming from evaporation in the crops. So it comes at a later time, typically around 5 o'clock actually, in southwestern Ontario and in parts of Canada is when it peaks. We talk about the frequency of tornado. Canada gets about 100 tornadoes a year. The United States about 1,000. But April last year, there was 753 tornadoes alone in the United States. Of those tornadoes, typically about 70%, a little less than 70% of them are the weaker tornadoes. About 28% are the stronger ones, and only 2% are the really, really strong tornadoes, the F4s, the F5s. But they account for 70% of the deaths. So it's hard to say if you can have more than one tornado. You absolutely can in an area. It's just the conditions have to be right. But as I talked about, it's a cyclical thing. So one tornado, one storm that spawns a tornado, when it dies, it actually provides the energy for the next one.
So again, this tornado, again, the 20 kilometers by half a kilometer wide,
that was one track. It was continuous.
That's a damage footprint of 10 square kilometers.
It wasn't always
huge.
400 to 500 meters wide. That's what it was in the core when it was its strongest. Once we got out to Ben Miller, it was hard to track at different times, but there was a continuous 20-kilometer path. We zigzag across the concession lines to try and find it and track it, and ask to walk through people's fields. And
so how many tornadoes a year in Canada would we expect to see of that kind of size or magnitude? Or is this?
About 30%.
30% would be this one?
Yeah. But again, you have to think about the geography of Canada. Often they happen in fields.
Yeah, they don't hit anybody here. Yeah.
Interesting thing I find is, for the longest time, Environment Canada said the average number of tornadoes in Ontario is 10, and then it went up to 11. Now they're using 13 as their official number. So, not looking at it from a return period point of view, but an average point of view, they're now using 13 as the number.
So on average, 3 a year could hit Ontario that are comparable in size to this, just that they don't hit a populated area.
But it's all statistics. That doesn't mean in a given year you're going to get these. The strongest one that happened that was of this magnitude in Ontario, I believe, was 1996 for this. So it was quite...
Is that the same one that was just referred to earlier in the same town?
No, this one was in farther south.
Dufferin area.
It was an F3.
Can you quantify or estimate the percentage of damage caused by the storm versus debris? So we pay, what's the number in Goderich? $135 million.
I would think
debris versus storm. Is it, or is that the wind caused this much, but debris caused the vast majority?
I think you use 40% in hurricanes, 50 to 60 in tornadoes.
40%, which is the reported number from Hurricane Andrew. I would think tornadoes are probably higher.
Because of the violent nature.
I think it's really hard to quantify that. But I would, as an order of magnitude, I'd say half. Put a band on that.
So, just to go back, half the damage is caused by debris, and the building code says nothing.
That's correct.
Sorry if I'm being a Trump.
ASC 7, which governs design in the U.S., has requirements for debris in hurricane regions. So the lower 60 feet of high-rise buildings are required to be debris impact considered in design. That's the only place residences are not.
And the second, I have to follow up. You had tons of pictures of windows, okay, as opposed to inside the buildings and stuff. So, is there, or have you tested a way to protect windows? Like I know we had the 3M people come in at ICLR, and they have a film that they want to throw baseball bats and stuff like that. Is there a way to test or look at protecting windows? And if the assumption I'm making, you can tell me if it's a good assumption, you protect the window and you protect most of what's inside and the people.
But these films don't prevent the window from breaking. They prevent it from sharding. And okay. They never claim that it prevents the window from breaking. It's preventing it from shredding a human being, basically, and for also trying to prevent break-in. But the window, just like a piece of auto glass, the glass will break, but it'll come off kind of in a sheet, as opposed to protected completely.
It's, I mean, there is storm shutters, which are used in hurricane regions, which are impact tested to standards. You can buy those if you live in Miami. You can buy them if you live here. But, well, how long was the warning? 5 minutes, right? I mean, so you have to put these things in place, and you should be going for shelter, not playing with your shutters. You have 5 minutes, you know, a tornado's 5 minutes away, right? So that's the challenge with tornadoes. So other things have to happen. That's one of the reasons why we're arguing for hurricane straps, which add only a few $100s to houses, for example, but it keeps less things out of the debris field. It keeps the roof structure on, which will save lives, and the cost of it is minimal. If we put it on every single house, I think the cost is negligible, because builders will find a way to make sure that that happens when you start mass producing. So that's one of the things we're arguing. Keeping things out of the debris field by holding it together is important.
If there was a 5-minute warning given, how effective was that, and how many people were reached by that?
That's an interesting discussion. Environment Canada is looking at it. We talked to them earlier this week. There's a book that chronicles, I think, 30 or 40 people that were impacted by this, and not a single one that was interviewed was aware there was a warning, in effect. Now, the warnings are issued, if you're looking at the weather, a red band on their website will come up. If you're watching one of the weather networks or one of their stations, it will come up. If you have a weather radio, it will turn on. But
if you're at the fruit market?
So they're looking into issues. They're looking at ways to reach the mass market. What's the best way of doing that? A lot of people now have smartphones. Is there a way to do that easily? They're looking at it, but not everyone has them. Down in the States, some of the weather stations will send you a text message. You can subscribe to that. but it hasn't come in here. I know that there's systems in development now to try and get that out. They did have the warning in place, but if no one knew about it, that is a challenge. There's also some interesting things about Goderich. The storm was rotated. In Goderich, it wasn't a typical classical supercell. So there was some issues that normally you get the warnings of the light rain, the heavier rain, the hail. It was slightly rotated, so you didn't get that classical image. It may have played a small impact, but the marine tornado warning was issued 15 minutes in advance, and the land was only issued about 5 minutes in advance.
In the Goderich, they did have the market, but the market apparently started shutting down at around 2 because it was raining, and so people were leaving. So there were still some people in the market square around the courthouse, but it was less than what they had earlier. The trick is, and I think it came, again, Environment Canada told us that they were fortunate in that there were less people because around the square where the market was, all the doors were closed. There was no place to go inside for shelter because everything was closed down. So we were fortunate that there weren't more fatalities.
Down in the United States, when we were chasing, we were in areas that were very prone to tornadoes, and there was sirens. Like, we would drive through a county, if there was a warning on in that county, the sirens went off. But there's a challenge with that, too, because counties can cover many, many square miles down in the States, and if it even just covers 1 square mile, it goes off in the entire county. So you start to ignore it at that point in time, because it's not in your area, it's in someone else's area, but how do you know that? We were checking into a hotel in Beatrice, Nebraska, and the warning was going off when we were in the building, and the lady says, I have to stop checking you in, I have to go through our protocols. And we're like, we're storm chasers, you don't have to. Like, the warning is 50 miles away. But because it's part of the county, the sirens are going off, she's being notified that she has to put her plan in place. But there's 40-some of us there and saying, no, you don't need to. But, like, how do you account for that? Like, I'm going to start to ignore them if you get them constantly. Environment Canada got a lot of flack the week after Goderich because they issued a warning across almost the entire province, southwestern Ontario, and I think there was one that materialized, but it was in a field and did almost no damage, and everyone is saying, well, you had one out in Goderich and no one knows, and now you sent out one for almost the entire province and nothing happened. So there's a lot of social things that come into play too. There are some students that are looking at the impact and warnings and different things like that are doing research on that right now.
What's the enhanced Fujita, and are we going to move to the enhanced?
It's an excellent question. The enhanced Fujita scale is a change to the original Fujita scale, and it has better damage indicators and degrees of damage. The ones that I actually showed you are from the enhanced Fujita scale, the degree of damages. We have not adopted it here in Canada. It is under discussion, but there are some challenges that it was developed for the United States and Canada is different. It would be nice to have a consistent system because we are all one continent. It doesn't stop at the border. Even if you look at the weather stops at the border because of legal issues. But as of this point right now, we have not adopted the ES system for Canada. Dr. Kopp's working on that a lot.
Tornadoes and hurricanes are perhaps really scary wind events that could come. The difference between what happened at Goderich and a really bad hurricane, here in the peak area, the strength of the wind was much greater than you would get during a hurricane. I mean, this was just really powerful winds. A hurricane, there's lots of water everywhere. So here it was raining, but during a hurricane, you use a really strong expression, and it's just really coming down here, right? But here, the amount of water, with all those windows broken or whatever, I mean, it wasn't like water was gushing in.
Not gushing in, no. The rain actually preceded the storm, and then there was a calm time, and then the tornado hit. And there was a little bit of rain afterwards, because some of the courthouse was damaged with water infiltration, but it wasn't flooding the streets, it wasn't accumulating. It was dry when we got there. I got some mud on my boots, but it wasn't significant.
So this was really a wind event, whereas a hurricane, it's a mix of water and wind, maybe even more water sometimes than wind.
This would be considered to be a rare event too, because the storm came off the lakes, and the lakes typically don't increase storms, they tend to decrease them. So earlier in the day, there were some warnings in Michigan on the other side of the lake, but you don't expect it to cross the lake, and there was many hours in between the different warnings in the States and Canada. They said that Environment Canada has mentioned if there was a tornado in Goderich anywhere in southwestern Ontario, is at risk because you wouldn't have expected Goderich to hit just because it's right on the coast and storms don't tend to strengthen over the water.
I remember seeing some of the pictures of tree damage from Hurricane 1 where I went through Halifax and a lot of Atlantic Canada and a really big event in Vancouver. So here there were trees around the courthouse, or in that corridor that got horribly damaged. But further away the trees were probably fine?
Mostly branch damage the farther you get away from the core.
Whereas in Halifax, I mean, it was just acres and acres of trees all blown down.
You get challenges with rot there too, with the root system, just because the water doesn't leave right away. There's so much it's inundated that you actually get the roots rotting, and then you have problems with the strength of the trees as well.
I think one of the aspects of Halifax and other hurricane areas is the ground's saturated, and then the wind comes in, and it's different when the ground is fairly dry and the wind comes versus when the ground is soaked. The trees fall down a lot easier.
I have a different tree question. In your opinion, from the survey, did the trees help reduce damage or help cause damage? Because you have pictures of them catching things, and then you have other pictures of them falling over.
I think it's a bit of column A, a bit of column B, because the trees can become projectiles themselves, but they do trap debris as well. Most of the impacts that we saw were from structural materials, but it's interesting too because the trees that failed in the Goderich courthouse didn't move downwind, they got trapped. And so upwind of the Goderich courthouse square was those big brick buildings that failed, and it trapped some of them there. But the trees themselves that broke on the courthouse square, some branches got dislodged, but these trees were just so huge, so massive, they pretty much just toppled over on the square. So they would have caught some of the debris, but in other areas they did become projectiles themselves.
Are big trees or little trees more at risk? You had the picture, there was one of the pictures, you had a car on its side, and it hit out a light standard, and then right beside the light standard was a little evergreen. So, with all the big trees you took pictures of, all the big trees are done, but the little tree struck me as just sitting there.
The bigger trees that failed here, for the most part, had big cross-sections at the top that the wind had a large area to push over. So from what we saw, most of the damage was to the big mature trees.
Is that normal?
I haven't done a tree survey before, but I know that there's a lot of variability with the species, the ground, the root system, things like that.
Well, wind speed also increases with height, so
the big trees.
big trees.
Are there any lessons learned from this event about protective actions for citizens? I know there's been a lot of reference to how lucky people were, but in a deliberate, if someone were to take deliberate action to protect themselves, what sort of lessons learned could be taken from here?
Really just being aware of the warnings that are out there. There are systems that you can have, like if you have a weather radar or weather radio in your house, it activates when if you're aware, then you can take the precautions, but if you're not taking steps to make yourself aware of the weather that's going on around you. But one interesting note, you talk about protection, but there's also the question of response. And in this situation, there was 9 OPP precincts and a number of different medical services, EMS, that came, and they all worked cohesively as a team, despite the fact that they are all based in different cities. And I think that prevention in some ways can be dealt with the training to work together no matter where you're from. It was seamless. There was OPP officers from every small community in the area that were there, whether they were on duty or not. There's a number of pictures here where you see civilian clothes and someone's wearing a police jacket because they heard it on the radio and they got in their car and came to help. So preparedness in that way is knowing that you can work as a team, but I think the best way is really being informed as to if there's an event potential in your area. If there's a watch, take precautions. If there's a warning, have a plan, know where you're going to go.
What about that person, that family that was in the vehicle? Was that the right place for them? Did that give you the greatest probability of surviving? Or would there have been another behavior that they might have followed had they had more time?
Had they had more time, I would have suggested they find a building with a basement to go to, or at the very least, an internal room with no windows to the exterior. But it's hard to say because every storm is different. If you know that you're in a risk for a tornado, are you in a risk for an F0 or an F1 tornado that might move your vehicle? Or are you in the risk for an Eli tornado, which was an F5 that made the vehicles airborne? It's really hard to say, but ultimately the safest place is in a basement.
Going back to the storm track thing, you said it was 20 kilometers long, but you said some parts it wasn't so much damage.
It wasn't as wide. Yeah.
Fair to say that like 90% of the damage here was within half a kilometer of the courthouse?
Absolutely. The majority of the damage outside of town, there was a couple structures in Ben Miller. There was lots of damage to the trees in the forest that were out that area. There was some minor damage to the Ben Miller Inn that was due to downed power lines, but the majority of the damage was in the town of Goderich itself.
So the lack of damage along the track is just due to the lack of structure, as opposed to storm.
You can see it going through crops. You can see it going through forests, and the damage is still there, but it's not.
So the intensity of the wind was consistent along a large portion of that track?
It did vary, because you always find one area of the track is stronger rated than other areas. So some of the Ben Miller stuff was rated as F0, F1. I think there was one structure that was F2 farther down the track. But we always rate it as the highest event, and it was an F3. It wasn't an F3 the entire track, but there was F3 along the track, which means that it was an F3 tornado.
So had that event gone through Windsor, it would have been a much different damage scenario.
I was asked at one of my speeches, a little bit of a quiz. This woman said to me, I live in a century home, and it has a new building code addition with a crawl space. Do I go in the basement of the old home or the crawl space of the new home? I figured the full basement of the old home. Is that the right answer?
I would go for the basement.
Yeah.
The full basement.
Kind of a unique
harder to get into the crawl space. I assume it'd take more time.
Yeah, but even, you know, from a building code perspective, this person's living with both. No code maybe, or light code versus new code, full basement, shallow, crawl space. What do you do? So I'm glad I told her I thought the full basement was
Whichever's closer.
A personal question, what comes next? A very interesting background you've had. What do you want to do going forward?
I actually love what I'm doing now. It's a horrible thing to say, but we learn a lot from damage surveys. It's a stressful thing going because when you do get the occasion to talk to people, they provide you with really crucial information on what was your structure like before. Google Earth helps a lot with that now because there's images, but you can say, like, did you have your door closed? Was your door open? Different things like that. But they're also in shock. So it's challenging from a social perspective talking to them. Their building has been destroyed, their memories are gone. But I truly believe that I can learn a lot more from participating in more damage surveys. It helps my research a lot. I just got some data last week from being in the wind tunnel, so I'm looking forward to looking at that and trying to really answer the question of what wind speed causes flight versus what wind speed causes failure, and how do we address that in the Fujita scale. In Canada, using the Fujita scale, if your roof is gone, it's an F2, regardless of whether it flew or failed, regardless of whether it was attached properly or not. We have some new abilities to put some discretion into that, but if you go purely by, if you lost your roof, it's an F2. So I'd really like to get into the physics of why this is happening. How do we determine that? I enjoyed storm chasing, although being on crutches meant it was a little more challenging. I stayed in the vehicle a lot because when they say, we need to go, you have like 2 seconds to get in the vehicle, otherwise you're in trouble. So I took a lot of those pictures from the vehicle. So I guess storm chasing not with an extra set of feet would be nice. But really, I'm just looking forward to getting into the data and trying to determine more. We have colleagues now down in the States and out in Australia, and their damage surveys are being shared with us more and more, and we can learn about different construction practices and how it affects things. Lots more. I've been doing this for about 2 years now, and I have another 2 years with Dr. Cox, so I'm looking forward to getting some more answers. I know better now what kind of pictures to take. The first survey you're with, you're really relying on the people that have been there before for experience on what to concentrate on. Like that picture of the Venetian blinds, no use whatsoever, but looks really cool. Now I get both, not just the cool pictures, but the useful ones too. Well, thank you very much for this opportunity. It's been lovely to be here, and I've enjoyed the questions, and hope to keep the discussion going throughout the years.
Thank you.
Thank you.